Welcome to this video about OAuth. OAuth is mostly about delegating authority. Now, to explain what delegating authority is, I'm using this example where I have a class and there's an instructor and there's a tutor for the class. Now, this tutor might be taking another class from the same instructor. So, what the instructor will want to do is give the tutor the permission or authority to assign grades for this specific class, but not all of the classes because the tutor could become a student in another class that the instructor teaches. So the instructor doesn't just want to give the tutor his password because then the tutor can access everything that the instructor can access. And if the tutor belongs to a class that the instructor also teaches, then he's given the tutor the authority to assign his own grade, which wouldn't be good. So OAuth 2 is something that Google and Twitter and a lot of other people got together and designed that allows websites to delegate authority. So in this example, the instructor will delegate or give the tutor some authority to act on his behalf to assign grades for a specific class. To understand how OAuth works, it's really important to understand how this 302 or redirection works. So if a browser makes a request, usually the user will click on a link or submit a form, and that causes the browser to make a request to a server, let's say asking for page 1. Now the server says, you know what, page 1 doesn't really exist. We should send you to some other place. The server will send a 302 back, and the only thing that comes back is the location of another page. So the browser, without displaying anything to the user, will make a second request to the server asking for page 2. And now, again, the user has no idea that the browser is now making this second request. So when the browser makes the second request for page 2, the server will then send page 2 back to the browser. So what the user sees is he clicks on the link or submits a form, and all he sees is page 2 coming back. The user doesn't see behind the scenes that the browser made a request for page 1, got a 302 back, and then the browser decided to make a request for page 2, and then it displays page 2 back. For the user, it just looks like he clicked a link and he landed on page 2. So by the way, when I say 302, that's the status code in the HTTP response. So this is how the HTTP response looks like for the request, or is for the response coming back for the request for page 1. The server says, you know what, I found the page, but it's located at some different spot, and this is the location that it is located at. And that's why the browser decides to make a second request for page 2. Now this is how OAuth 2 works and how we're going to use OAuth 2 to implement a federated login. So let's say that Bob is creating a really cool site and he wants people to sign up through Facebook. So what he does is he creates a button, or actually Facebook, he could take a button that he found on the web or from Facebook that says, sign up with Facebook. And basically he just makes a link that the user can click on. But before he can do any of that, Bob first has to go to Facebook and register his application or his website so that Facebook knows about Bob's cool site. So as he registers his application with Facebook, Facebook is going to give Bob two things back. One thing is an ID, and this is just going to be a unique string that identifies Bob's cool site, and so Facebook knows that this ID belongs to Bob's cool site. He's also going to give, and I'll call this ID just 1, 2, 3, but really it's a long string that's hard to guess. The other thing that Facebook gives him is something called a secret. And since it is a secret, Bob should not publish this anywhere, and he should make sure that it's not out in the open. And the secret, again, is just like a password. That way, if somebody does get Bob's ID, they still need a password to be able to act as Bob to Facebook. So we'll just call this pass, short for password. So once again, Bob went to Facebook. He registered his application. Facebook gives him an ID and a secret. So that the secret is so that Bob can register with Facebook, and Facebook knows that it's really Bob. And the ID uniquely identifies Bob's site. Now, after Bob has set up everything with his website, hopefully he'll get users to be able to come to his site. And let's say that we have a user named George. Now, George has an account at Facebook, like most people do, and so he's already registered with Facebook, and he lands on Bob's cool site, and George really likes Bob's cool site and wants to sign up, but George does not want to create a new password. So he sees the sign up with Facebook button, and he's going to click the link. And by clicking the link, George will make a request to Bob's website saying, I would like to sign up through Facebook. Now, um, what Bob's site is going to send back is one of those redirections. So in the response, he's going to give back a 302, and he is going to say, you know what, the page you're looking for to the browser, it's going to say the page you're looking for is facebook.com with a special path used to complete this OAuth ceremony here that's going to allow all of this to work. And in that path will be the ID of 1, 2, 3. So yes, he is giving out his ID in the open. And if you look at this transaction and you're a hacker, yes, you can get the ID, but without the secret, you can't really act on Bob's behalf. So he gives the 302 back to the browser. Now the browser sees that 302 and is automatically going to make another HTTP request to Facebook that includes the ID on it, so that Facebook knows that George knows that someone is trying to sign up for Bob's cool site because it sees the 123 ID and it knows that that is Bob's cool site. Now, this next step might or might not happen depending on if George is logged into Facebook or not. So let's assume that George is not logged into Facebook yet. So what Facebook will send back to George will be a login form that asks him to log into Facebook. Now, if George is already logged into Facebook, like on another tab, then this step isn't necessary. But then George will go ahead and log into Facebook. So now Facebook knows that George, because he just logged in, or he was already logged in before, is trying to sign up for Bob's cool site. It knows it's Bob's cool site because the ID was in the original URL, and it knows that it's George because George just logged in. So after he logs in, Facebook is going to send a page back to George saying Bob's cool site would like some information about you. Do you want to authorize this? Or it might say another question. Bob's cool site is trying to act on your behalf. Do you want to give him access to do this list of things? Now, the list of things was probably set up when Bob registered his application with Facebook saying, I'd like to be able to post on George's wall, or I'd like to send messages on behalf of George, or not necessarily George, but any user. Or in our case, I'd just like to read a little bit of information about this user. So Facebook sends that page back to George and it says, would you like to give Bob's cool site access to this? And since George really likes Bob's cool site, he feels like he trusts it, he's going to click the authorize button, which will send another request back to Facebook. And so Facebook will know that George has agreed to share his information and allow Bob to act on his site. So finally, Facebook is going to send back a 302 request, and in this case, the location is going to be Bob's Cool Site, and as part of the URL, it's going to have a code. Now the code is going to be a really long string, harder to guess than a password, and in my case, I'll use ABC, but really a long, hard to guess string, so it sends the redirection back to George, and then with that redirection, George's browser will make another request. Now, George won't see this redirection. It'll make another request to Bob's site that includes the ABC or that code that Facebook gave him. And you'll see why it created a code in the next step. So the next step is Bob just got this code back from George's browser, and it went through the URL. This code went through the URL, and then the browser made the request with that code to Bob's site. So now Bob has a code. So now Bob can talk directly to Facebook, and he can include his ID, 123. He includes his password or the secret, and he includes the code ABC. So he gives all that information to Facebook. Now, the reason for this step is to verify that it really is Bob that can collect this information, because without the secret, somebody could pretend to be Bob's cool site, but we really want to make sure it's Bob. So we make Bob make another request to Facebook, and notice this doesn't go to George, so no hacker can get it, but he makes a request to Facebook with his password, and this, of course, is an encrypted communication between Bob's cool site and Facebook, and then Facebook will give back to Bob what is called a token. And Facebook probably saves the token in its database, and the token uniquely identifies Bob's cool site and George, saying that George gave permission for Bob's cool site to act on his behalf. Now, the final step in this is, now that Bob's cool site has the token, he can use the token to communicate with Facebook and say, can I have George's personal information, like his email and his name, and anything else that I might want to collect about George? And then because George gave him permission to read that, then Facebook will send back George's email and name. Now, another thing that gets sent back is also Facebook's unique ID for George. If you don't know, every user in Facebook has a unique ID. It's their database ID. So Facebook will also send back the ID back to Bob's cool site. Now, Bob's cool site, he can take that ID. He can also take the token and the ID. He can save that in the database as a new user and create the new user and say, this new user has a Facebook ID of this. Now, he'll go ahead and create an account for George, and George will be logged in. Now, let's say that George does something else. He closes the browser, he comes back to Bob's cool site and wants to log in again. They will repeat this entire process. This entire thing that I just described will get repeated. But this time, we'll see, this time Bob's cool site will see, oh, you know what? I've seen that ID before, and that ID belongs to this account that I created, and that happens to be George's account. So instead of creating a new account for George, he'll just log in George to the account that was created the first time George clicked on the sign up through Facebook button. Now, by the way, the second time George clicks this sign up button, so he's already signed up and logged in once, now he wants to log in again. The second time he does it, Facebook will skip this authorization step right here because George has already authorized it and Facebook has saved that status. So the second time George clicks this link, he'll just have to log into Facebook, and after he logs in, Facebook will automatically send this redirection, and then we'll go through that process. Now, if George happens to already be logged in to Facebook, let's say he logged in before and he hasn't logged out, or he has Facebook opened in another tab, if he clicks this link, Facebook clicks this link, he'll make this request to Facebook. Facebook already knows it's George, and he already knows that George authorized Bob's Cool Site. So Facebook will just redirect him right back to Bob's Cool Site, and he'll be logged in. And George will have no idea that his browser made a request to Facebook, and that Facebook said, yep, everything looks great, and I'll send the code back. And then George's browser will do another redirection back to Bob's Cool Site. All that George will see, he'll click on this link, and then he'll be back on Bob's Cool Site, logged in already. So one thing as you're developing your federated login, just know that after you authorize it the first time, unless you delete the authorization on, and we're going to use GitHub or Facebook, unless you delete the authorization, they won't ask you again if it's okay because you already said it was okay.